Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Africans and Native Americans, The Language of Race and the Evolution of Red-Black Peoples, by Jack D. Forbes. Narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to tables included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Introduction. Thousands of volumes have been written about the historical and social relations existing between Europeans and the native peoples of the Americas and between Europeans and Africans, but relations between Native Americans and Africans have been sadly neglected. The entire Afro-Native American cultural exchange and contact experience is a fascinating and significant subject, but one largely obscured by a focus upon European activity and European colonial relations with peripheral subject peoples. Africans and Americans must now be studied together without their relations always having to be obscured by the separations established through the work of scholars focusing essentially upon some aspect of European expansion and colonialism. It is especially important to note here, at the very beginning of the study, that those relations do not begin only in the Americas. On the contrary, they also take place in Europe and in Africa, and perhaps also in the Pacific. Contacts in Europe can be seen as significant because both the African and Native American ancestry there has tended to be absorbed into the general European society, and whatever earlier cultural developments have occurred have now become part of modern European culture. The impact of non-European peoples upon European societies directly within Europe has not, as of yet, been fully explored. And, of course, there is now a large new group of Native Americans and people of African background in Europe. Contacts in the Americas have been studied to some extent, but much work remains to be done. Contacts in Africa have been studied very little. The fact of a relatively small but steady American presence in Africa from at least the early 1500s onward may well prove to be a vital area for future research, since one would expect to find Native American cultural influences in regions such as Angola, Zaire and Ghana, Guinea, Cape Verde especially. It is, of course, interesting to note that some Africans were already exposed to American cultural influences before leaving Africa. The cultures brought by Africans to the Americas may already have been influenced, especially by Brazilian Native Americans. The extent of such cultural exchange will obviously have to be worked out in careful field research in Angola, Ghana, Guinea, Cabo Verde, and other places, as well as in archival records. This study has a modest objective in that it seeks to introduce the subject and to primarily deal with a series of basic issues or questions which have to be resolved before proceeding to a detailed analysis of the precise nature of African-American relations. Raymond Williams, in Keywords, 1976, has shown the importance of confronting the issue of meaning as a fundamental aspect of scholarship. I propose to apply his example to the basic terms which inform our understanding of African-American contact and mixture, terms which are part of a nomenclature developed under colonialism and racism. Long ago, when first working with my own Powhatan Lenape people of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and surrounding areas, I discovered that the meaning of racial terms was a controversial issue. I learned that terms such as mulatto and colored were used, or had been used, in Virginia in quite a different way from their usage in most books, including modern dictionaries. I also discovered that many questions were not answerable within the context of the latter, such as, what do you call a person of mixed American, European, and African ancestry? No one provided any answer because, it seems, the American mixture with the African was generally subordinated to a focus upon, or fascination with, only the black-white nexus. The modern dictionaries all stated that a mulatto was the child of a black and a white, or someone of mixed black and white ancestry. But where did that leave those who were also part Indian? In any case, I discovered that Native American descendants had been legally defined as mulattoes in Virginia in 1705, without having any African ancestry. Thus I knew that the dictionaries were wrong and that there was a lot that was hidden from view by the way most authors had written about the southern United States, about slavery, and about colored people. I later discovered also that the same thing was true as regards the Caribbean, Brazilian, and much of the rest of the Americas. The unraveling of misconceptions is almost as important as the creation of new conceptions, it would seem, and this is nowhere more true than in the realm of race relations. So, before one can seriously reconstruct Black African Native American contacts, one must clear away a lot of mistakes arising out of the very nature of discourse in a racist colonial setting, as well as mistakes arising from the assumption that the current meanings assigned to racial terms have an equal validity for the past. As the listener will find out, there is hardly a racial term which has a clear and consistent meaning over time and space. For example, the term Indian, or Indio, has been applied to many peoples including the Indians of South Asia as well as all groups found in the West Indies, the Americas, and the East Indies, Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, etc. The term Negro has been applied to Black Africans, the Indians of India, Native Americans, Japanese, and slaves of whatever ancestry. Black has been used for all of the above and for non-whites in general. By way of illustration, in attempting to grapple with the problem of Black African Native American mixture and especially with the question of to what extent African Americans throughout the Americas are part American Indian, it is first necessary to focus upon a clarification of such racial or ethnic terms as were used in the colonial and early national periods. Key terms include mulatto, pardo, colored, free-colored, Negro, Zambo or Sambo, musty, and mestizo. As noted, many modern writers, whether popular or scholarly, have simply assumed they could transfer 16th, 17th, or 18th century racial terms to contemporary usage without any critical examination of meaning. For example, it has been assumed generally that a mulatto of, let us say, 1600 would be of the same racial background as a mulatto of 1865 or of 1900, or that a colored person of 1830 would be the same as a colored person of 1930. Moreover, it has also been assumed that terms such as free Negro and free colored can be used interchangeably, and that one could, in more recent usage, substitute free Black for either of these. Many prominent writers have, it seems, been very lax in their failure to consider that the meaning of a word is never a timeless, eternal constant, but rather as a constantly evolving, changing pointer. Thus, the word coach, as used in the 19th century, stagecoach or other horse-drawn vehicle, then later a railway coach, has today become something different, for example, motor coach. And while we can trace the obvious connection between stagecoach, railway coach, and motor coach, it is still quite clear that we would be badly mistaken to interpret get on the coach of 1840, for example, as meaning get on the bus of 1960. And of course, the term coach has other meanings today, aside from motor coach. We may think we know what the word Negro means today, but do we know what it meant in 1800 in Virginia? And did it mean the same as colored? The answer to these questions is not and cannot be an exercise in deductive logic or a priori reasoning. It is, rather, an empirical problem which can only be solved by discovering through documentary and other evidence exactly how such terms were used. This is not an easy task, for reasons which will become clearer later. In short, we cannot move, historiographically, from word to word or concept to concept across the centuries. We must instead actually engage the primary data in order to touch reality. When we discover that one of Sir Francis Drake's pilots, not an airline pilot incidentally, in 1595 was Isilieno de Nation mulatto and sailed from Plymouth, England, through being an islander in origin, we should not picture him as if he were a mulatto of 1981 or of 1900. His precise racial background is not established by the use of the term mulatto, as we shall see. We must ascertain from other evidence, if we can, what the Spanish author meant by his usage of this category. During the summer of 1981, newspapers in the United States carried stories about blacks rioting in British cities. What they failed to tell their readers was that in Britain today the term black is applied not only to Africans or West Indians, of whatever shade or mixture, but also to people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and even to Latin Americans. For example, a very light-skinned Chilean lady refugee living in Oxford was surprised to be referred to as a black. Her dark hair, Spanish accent, and immigrant status had caused her to become black, at least to some English contacts. I have before me an appeal to drop all charges against black youth, which refers to the arrest of some young Asians in Bradford during the summer of 1981. This modern British usage, which usage extends well back into earlier years, reflects very vividly the problem of assuming that English terms such as black, Negro, mulatto, or colored can be interpreted easily when found in documents of earlier eras. When the Europeans first established intensive contacts with Africans and part Africans, they met people with a great variety of physical characteristics. This was especially true in the Iberian Peninsula and Mediterranean area, but undoubtedly many of the Moors and blackamoors who came to England in Shakespeare's day were of North African as well as sub-Saharan background and from many distinct nations. Later in the 16th and 17th centuries, diversity was also encountered, as when most English vessels sailing to the Caribbean dropped anchor at the Cabo Verde Islands. One writer in 1647 commented on the extreme variability of physical types met there and the great beauty of the mixed Cabo Verde women. We must realize, therefore, that at the very beginning of the modern period, racial terms as used by Iberians and as acquired by the English were going to refer to part African peoples who might not only have the features of the Gulf of Guinea, variable as they are, but also every conceivable combination of Central African, Ibero-African, Afro-Arabic, and American African mixtures. And for our purposes, it is important to stress that many Africans from the Sahel or Savannah Belt, Hausa, etc., as well as from parts of East Africa, sometimes resemble American African hybrids, with various combinations of high cheekbones, prominent aquiline noses, semi-wavy or bushy hair, oriental eye shapes, etc. Why is this important? Simply because many part American, part African persons with no European ancestry could easily be subsumed under a racial term applicable to pure-blood Africans, and would not, in any case, be especially recognizable to most observers as being part American. The predominant physical type of the slaves brought in from Africa may have been that of coastal West Africa, but enough variability existed so that terms such as blackamoor, Negro, and black cannot a priori be assumed to be useful for determining precise genetic identity. Many color terms, such as dark, swarthy, and brown, are also quite ambiguous, as should be obvious. In a 1756 list of militiamen in King and Queen County, Virginia, for example, one finds, in addition to fair-complexioned persons, Thomas Delaney as dark, Benjamin Wilson as dark, James Willimore as brown, John Major as brown, John Kemp as swarthy, but with light hair and freckles, John Evans as dark, and Richard Riddle as dark. All or most of these men were born in Virginia, and several were planters. Were they part American or part African? Certainly we cannot judge their race from such color reference alone. Similarly, in 1768, an advertisement appeared in New Jersey for an apprentice lad named John Foster, born in the Jerseys, about 5 feet 8 inches high, of a dark complexion, and pitted with the smallpox, wears his hair with a false queue to it. In any case, the colonial and state courts in the United States frequently had difficulty in determining exact racial status. In 1859, a North Carolina court called in a planter as an expert who could distinguish between the descendants of a Negro and a white person, and the descendants of a Negro and an Indian. He could also, allegedly, differentiate between a pure African and a white cross or an Indian cross. Unfortunately, most of us today lack that kind of certain expertise, whatever phenotypical features are seized upon as evidence providing proof. In our efforts to reconstruct the story of Black African-Native American relations, it is necessary then to begin with an analysis of the evolution of the meaning of racial terms, for only in this way can we hope to identify people of American and African ancestry in the past. But the study of words alone does not, in fact, reveal the subtleties of actual usage, and thus I have had to delve into many aspects of Native American Black African history in order to reconstruct the environments in which racial and color terms have evolved and been given a new or different content. The listener will find a great deal of the social and cultural history of Afro-Americans and Native Americans in this work, woven together with broad social history as it relates to colonialism, slavery, and racism. But the primary purpose of this study is not to write a comprehensive account of Native American-African relations, but rather to establish a sound empirical and conceptual basis for further study in this area, and more importantly, to demonstrate beyond any doubt that old assumptions must be set aside. This latter is especially true as regards the extent of Native American-African mixture and the significant genetic contribution of Americans to present-day Black or Afro-American populations in the Caribbean, Brazil, the United States, and elsewhere. This work will, I hope, make a major contribution to the field of the history of race relations and, more specifically, to the study of the formation of plantation, Creole, and colonial cultures in the Americas and elsewhere. Because of the data presented herein, a great deal of revision will have to be made in these areas, as well as in the fields studying the evolution of modern African, Afro-American, and Native American cultures. Finally, I hope that this study of interethnic contact and racial classifying will lead to progress in the field of human rights by highlighting and clarifying a major area of abuse: the arbitrary and often racist practice of defining the identities of other human beings by powerful outsiders, as well as by governments and institutions. 1. Africans and Americans. Intercontinental contacts across the Atlantic to 1500. Americans crossing the Atlantic before Columbus. The meeting of Native Americans and Africans, of people from two great continents of the earth, can be described in many ways. A fitting mode in which to begin is to cite a Native American story from Guyana, presented by Jan Carew, in which Nian, an African sky spirit, along with the African Earth Mother, the African River Mother, and Anansi the spider trickster, met the Great Spirit, the Father Sun, and other spirit powers of the Americans. The next day, all the peoples of the earth complained to Father Sun, and for the first time, the ebony people who were neighbors of Tohono made themselves heard. The Great Spirit invited Nian, the anthracite-colored sky god, to share his domains. They, the African spirits, agreed on condition that the Great Spirit, in turn, shared the distant kingdoms of earth and sky that Nian ruled. Pia, an American child of the sun and of Tohono, the Mist Woman, became a brother to Anansi the Spider-Man, and both agreed to live among human beings. Thus, the spirit powers of the Black Africans are said to have established a close cooperative relationship with the spirit powers of the Americans. This same cooperation and reciprocal relationship can also be seen in Brazil, where Tupinamba and Guarani Candomblés exist side by side with those of Congo Angola and Nago orientation, and where Native American and African spiritual powers are called upon for assistance in various contexts. The dimensions of African-American contact can also be seen in a painting by the Dutch artist Jan Steen, 1645, in which the making of a marriage contract in the Netherlands area is depicted. The future bridegroom is of African ancestry, while a man of American race is an active onlooker on the right-hand side of the scene. The bride is of European Dutch background. Thus, in spiritual as well as secular contexts, the American and African peoples have interacted with each other in a variety of settings and situations. These interactions may well have begun in very ancient times. J. A. Rogers, Leo Weiner, Ivan van Sertima, and others have cited evidence, including the Olmec stoneheads of Mexico, pointing towards early contacts between American and African cultures. I do not propose here to explore the early archaeological evidence which, in essence, requires a separate study, but instead I will cite briefly some tantalizing data which suggests contacts in both directions. It is now well known that the Atlantic Ocean contains a series of powerful rivers or currents which can facilitate the movement of floating objects from the Americas to Europe and Africa, as well as from the latter to the Americas. In the North Atlantic, the most prominent current is that of the Gulf Stream, which swings through the Caribbean and then moves in a northeasterly direction from Florida to the Grand Banks off Terra Nova, Newfoundland, turning then eastwards towards the British Isles and the Bay of Biscay. This current has carried debris from Jamaica and the Caribbean to the Hebrides and Orkneys of Scotland. Moreover, Jean Marion tells us that valuable hardwood was commonly washed ashore along the coasts of Ireland and Wales. This timber from the ocean, borne by the Gulf Stream, really came from the rivers of Mexico. Marion, a student of transatlantic navigation by small vessels, also states that the first attempt, the first success, of crossing the Atlantic by one man could only come from the American side, because the crossing is much less difficult in that direction. A French writer has said, justly, in all probability, that if America had been the Old World, its inhabitants would have discovered Europe long before we did, in fact, discover America. This is because of the prevailing winds from the west as well as the currents. One can, says Marion, sail in a straight line from Boston via Newfoundland to Ireland or Cornwall with almost the certainty of fair winds. The other direction requires twice the distance, thrice the time, and 4 times the sweat. In the 1860s, a 48-foot-long sloop, Alice, was navigated from North America to the Isle of Wight in less than 20 days with very favorable winds, and in recent times a wooden raft was propelled from Canada to northern Europe by means of this ocean river. Moreover, Stephen C. Jett cites the 68-day passage of one William Verity from Florida to Ireland in a 12-foot sloop, as well as the crossing by 2 men from New York to the Scilly Islands in 55 days in a 17-foot dory powered only by oars. Thus, the Gulf Stream demonstrably can propel small craft successfully from the Americas to Europe. Perhaps this is the explanation behind the local Dutch tradition that holds that in AD 849, one Zurich arrived by boat to found the coastal city of Zierikzee, and why the local people believed that he had arrived in an Inuit (Greenland) kayak, which was on display there for several centuries. The kayak may, indeed, not have been Zurich's original craft, but it very possibly points toward a genuine folk tradition of a crossing of the Atlantic from the west. In this context, it is also worth noting a report that Columbus had information about strange people from the west who had reached Ireland prior to 1492, doubtless via the Gulf Stream. Marion tells us that Bartholomew or Christopher Columbus had made marginal notes in their copy of Pius II's Historia, 1477, to the effect that some men have come from Cathay by heading east. We have seen more than one remarkable thing, especially in Galway, in Ireland, 2 people tied to 2 wrecks, a man and a woman, a superb creature. Marion also believes that the first documented case of a single navigator crossing the Atlantic consists in the record of a Native American who reached the Iberian Peninsula long before Columbus's day. In the Middle Ages there arrived one day on the coast of Spain a man red and strange in a craft described as a hollowed tree. From the recorded description, which specifically states that he was not a Negro, he might well have been a native of America in a piragua, a dugout canoe. The unfortunate man, ill and enfeebled, died before he had been taught to make himself understood. To return to our discussion of the Gulf Stream, it should be noted that this eastward-flowing current has a southern extension which swings southwards along the west coast of Europe to the Iberian Peninsula and on to the Canary Islands. From the latter region it turns southwestwards and then westwards, returning to the Americas in the vicinity of Trinidad and rejoining the Caribbean segment of the Gulf Stream. Thus it would be theoretically possible to float in a great circle from the Caribbean to Europe and northwestern Africa and then back to the Caribbean. A Native American archaeologist, E.F. Greenman, has argued that the crossing of the North Atlantic was feasible before the end of the Pleistocene period, about 11,000 years ago, for a people with kayaks and the Beothuk type of canoe, from Newfoundland, If at that time the ocean was filled with floating ice from the Scandinavian and Labrador glaciers, and from freezing of the sea itself. The same author attempts to show many parallels between Pleistocene European and American cultures, but sadly neglects African comparisons. In any case, his argument is based solely upon hypothetical European movements toward the Americas, movements which would have had to fight against the currents and winds rather than flowing with them. Bartolomé de las Casas, in his monumental Historia de las Indias, cites examples of rafts or canoes, almachias, dead Americans, and debris reaching the Azores Islands before 1492. This evidence will be discussed later. Here it is only necessary to note that the Azores lay in an area of weak currents, but that, even so, with the help of winds from the west and northwest, some boats could reach the islands from the Americas. In the South Atlantic, as noted, a strong current runs from the west coast of North Africa towards Trinidad. Below that, a counter-current is sometimes shown, running eastwards from South America to the Gulf of Guinea. Then a strong current runs westwards from the mouth of the river Zaire, Congo, to the north of the Amazon, where it divides, part joining the northwesterly current which becomes the Gulf Stream and part swinging southwards along the coast of Brazil, until it veers eastwards across the Atlantic to Africa again, reaching southwestern Africa, from whence it curves northwards to rejoin the Zaire-Amazon current. Thus, as farther north, a great circle is formed. Fundamentally, what we see are two great circular rivers in the ocean, the northern circle running in a clockwise direction and the southern circle in a counterclockwise direction, with a smaller countercurrent in between, running eastwards. In the South Atlantic, Americans might have reached Africa via the countercurrent, or, more likely, via the Brazil to southwest Africa current. Africans could have either used the southern, westwards swing of the North Atlantic Circle or the northern, also westwards swing of the South Atlantic Circle, coming from the Sierra Leone-Senegal region or the Congo-Angola region respectively. Of course, one of the problems with the argument for early transatlantic crossings is that in the modern period such islands as Iceland, Bermuda, the Azores, the Madeiras, the Cabo Verdes, Tristan da Cunha, Ascension, and even São Tomé, off Nigeria and Cameroon, were uninhabited prior to documented Irish, Norse, and Portuguese occupations. On the other hand, some of these islands are small or far from major currents. Bartolomé de las Casas states that the Azores were the Islas Casatarides, mentioned by Strabo in his geography, and which islands were repeatedly visited by the Carthaginians. Allegedly, there lived in the Azores a people who wore loru or basso color, that is to say, people of the color of Native Americans or intermediate between white and black. The Canary Islands were inhabited in the 15th century by a people who were isolated from nearby Africa and whose cultures somewhat resembled those of some Americans. Moreover, the personal names of the many Canarios enslaved by the Spanish have a decidedly American ring about them, although such resemblances do not always mean a great deal. The Canarios are sometimes described as a loru, or brownish-colored people in the slave registers. The fact that the islands of Cabo Verde and Madeira were inhabited in the 15th century does indeed pose a problem for African navigation to the Americas. However, that will be discussed later. Now it is necessary to consider briefly evidence relating to the maritime capabilities of Americans in the late 15th century, to see whether voyages across the Atlantic might have been feasible. The Americans of the Caribbean region were outstanding navigators and seamen, as noted by the Spaniards and other Europeans. Christopher Columbus was impressed everywhere by their skill. He noted, for example, that their boats, barcos y barquillos, which they call canoas, were excellently made from a single tree, were very large and long, carrying sometimes 40 or 45 men, 2 or more codos, perhaps a man's breadth, in width. The American boats were unsinkable, and if in a storm they happened to capsize, the sailors simply turned them back over while swimming in the sea, bailing them out with gourds carried for that purpose. Andres Bernaldez recorded from Columbus that the Americans navigated in their canoas with exceptional agility and speed, with 60 to 80 men in them, each with an oar, and they went by sea 150 leagues or more. They were masters of the sea. A canoe was later discovered in Jamaica which was 96 feet long, 8 feet broad, made from a single tree.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?